a month and a half ago, I picked up the 2019 Stumpjumper 29, which was newly redesigned. And I picked it up for two reasons. One is I'd been hearing a lot of good things about that bike and I wanted to ride it and review it. The other reason was to compare a longer travel 29er to a longer travel 27.5. A lot has changed in the industry over the last few years, and the geometry and the riding characteristics of 29ers have really been improved. So I was really excited about trying the new crop of 29ers to see how it would compare to the 27.5 trail bike that I've been riding for so many years. So this video is going to be my conclusion of comparing these two types of bikes. I actually prefer the 29er for climbing. I felt like the 29er just flowed a little bit better over the rough climbs, particularly local trails. So locally we have trails that have roots and rocks on steep climbs, and the 29er just got over those a little bit better, and it didn't have the pedal strikes that I would get on the 27.5. In the 27.5, if there were a rock or root on a steep climb, if you didn't time your pedal strokes just right, you would hit those rocks and roots. Now for this video, I'm going to really be talking about 29 versus 27.5. I'll do a little bit of comparison of the Giant and the Specialized. And here's one of them, is Specialized chose to put a 170 millimeter length crank on their bikes, whereas Giant puts a 175, as do most other companies. In fact, this is the first mountain bike that I've ridden with a 170, that is the Specialized. And honestly, I think it was a pretty good spec choice because of the lack of pedal strikes. I did get a few on the 29er, but not near as many as the 27.5. But the bottom line for climbing is I just felt like the 29er flowed up the climbs a little bit better, whether they were fire roads or whether they were rough and technical climbs. Descending is where it's harder to pick a winner, and for me, there is not one clear winner. Descending on the 29er, I felt like I was more along for the ride, whereas the 27.5, I felt like I had a little bit more control. I felt like I could maneuver the bike around rocks or roots, just kind of pop off things a little bit easier. Skid the back tire if you had to. That was just easier on the 27.5, and it made the 27.5 a little bit more fun on the descents. I also felt like the 27.5 was more manageable on tight switchbacks, whether that was going up or down. If you saw the video of riding Bear Creek on the Stumpjumper 29, there was one section of trail with a really tight technical switchback that I could not make on the 29, and I've tried it 3 or 4 times. I've made that on the 27.5 before. Now I could probably make that corner if I kept trying it on the 29 as I got more used to the handling characteristics of the bike. But like I said, the 27.5 is just a little bit easier to manage around tight switchbacks. Now the advantage on the descents for the 29 is where it gets rough, and that bike is really stable, and the rougher and the faster you go, the more confidence you have on the 29. Now that being said, there were a couple of times on descents on the 29 where the bike kind of skipped sideways a little bit because it kind of took a line of its own. It's kind of hard to explain. It wasn't where I was in danger of crashing. It's just, like I said, you're kind of a little bit more along for the ride, and sometimes the bike will take its own line choice, whereas the 27.5, you can just pick those lines a little bit easier. Also on descents on the 29, you have to be careful that you don't just go barreling through a corner. So there were times when I was coming up on a tight corner and I was going really fast, and I had to remind myself to brake just a little bit earlier, because if I didn't, I would just go barreling straight through the corner with all that momentum that you carry on the 29. Now the good news is, if you get yourself into that situation where you got to slam on the brakes, on the 29 you can come to a stop really easily, or at least slow down really easily, because of all of that traction that you have with those 29 tires. And the Stumpy has 2.6 wide tires, so a ton of traction, a ton of grip for braking. I just want to mention that for enduro racing, which I actually may do a few next year because my son is wanting to get into enduro racing, I feel like a 29er is going to be a little bit faster. I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube, and for most courses, a 29er is a little bit faster because of all that momentum and because of that confidence that you can have when the trail gets really fast and rough. Something else I want to mention is, dropper seat posts, it's just standard equipment on a trail bike. For a 29er long travel trail bike, it's crucial, because there were times when I absolutely had to get my weight lower on the 29er. You sit up higher on the 29er, and you have to get your weight lower when there's a tight technical descent, or there's a tight turn that's also technical. Now here's where I want to give another comparison between the Giant and the Stump Jumper, and that is the suspension design. So Giant uses the Maestro suspension, which I've really come to love over the years. And the thing I like about Maestro is it's very plush. And so I felt like the Giant, the 27.5 Trance, the suspension was just a little bit more active. And by active, I mean it just responds better to smaller bumps. Whereas on the Stump Jumper, the suspension felt like it was just a little firmer, which is good for pedaling, especially when you're climbing. It does not feel as linear. Now, that being said, my next kind of thing I'm going to do with the Stump Jumper is I'm going to take some of the volume spacers out of the rear shock and see how that affects it. But when descending, I actually prefer the Giant Maestro. I love the way the tire just completely stays glued to the trail with that suspension design. Now, it's worth mentioning that part of that may be the shock, because the Giant Trance has the Fox DPX2 with the piggyback reservoir, and that's a phenomenal shock. It's a very plush shock, and it also has decent pedaling platform. So even though both of these bikes have 140 millimeters of travel, I honestly felt like the Giant had more travel. It felt like the Stump Jumper had 120 millimeters of travel instead of 140. Now, like I said, taking out the volume spacers may help, but let's talk about handling and cornering on the bikes. 29ers have come a long way in the handling department. I remember years ago when 29er cross-country bikes felt slow and sluggish, and then they improved the geometry and they just got so much better. The same evolution has happened with the longer travel 29ers. Years ago, like I said, 29ers that had more than 120, 130 millimeters of travel just felt like beasts. They were big, heavy, sluggish. This Stump Jumper 29er is one that it handles so well for a longer travel bike. And getting through tight technical corners, even though it's a tad easier on the 27.5, the 29er does a really good job. We were riding Blankets Creek north of Atlanta a week or two ago, and there was one section where I completely washed out the front end on the 27.5. There was a little bit of mud under leaves that I just didn't see, and it was kind of like a slow motion washout. Like I just felt the front tire just going, and then I just went down. I kind of wonder if I was on the 29er if that would have happened, because like I said, those are 2.6 tires in the 29ers, and you get a little bit more traction in the corners with the 29er. When I was preparing to do my trip to the mountains on these bikes, I kind of felt like I would come back from that trip with a clear winner. That was not the case. I still was a little undecided about the two bikes. I loved the agility of the 27.5 on descents, how it got around switchbacks. I loved the stability of the 29er. It wasn't until I did a trip to Santos, when I rode there, I finally felt like I knew which bike I would hold on to. So Santos has some really tight, technical, rocky sections, and even though the 27.5 is a little bit easier to maneuver on those types of trails, I felt like the 29er did a little bit better. I felt like it got over the rocks better and was still agile. In fact, I was pretty impressed with how agile the 29er was on those types of tight trails. It takes a little bit more maneuvering on the 29er, but the extra rollover ability, the extra momentum is worth it. So I've decided that I'm gonna hold on to the 29er and sell the 27.5. And here are the main reasons for doing that. One of them is I feel like it's going to be a little bit easier to transition from my cross-country 29er to the trail 29er. Also, I do feel like the 29er is a little bit better for my local trails, particularly the ones at Santos that are rocky and technical. I just felt better on that bike, and I did not have near as many pedal strikes. Also, like I had mentioned earlier, I feel like the 29er is going to be better for enduro racing if I were to get into that. And finally, it's just something new. I've been riding 27.5 for many, many years, and kind of learning a little bit different riding style is fun. It's new. In fact, the more I ride the 29er, the more I get used to it. If you went back and looked at my first ride review of the Stump Jumper 29er, I mentioned that I really felt awkward on that bike the first time I rode it. After I got used to it, and also after I flipped that chip to the higher setting, I started to adapt to the bike, adapting my riding style, and the more I rode it, the more comfortable I got on that bike. So to conclude all of this, there really is no clear winner between these two bikes. It's really going to come down to your riding style and maybe the trails that you ride. For example, my son, who's 14 right now, he rides a Trance 27.5, and that bike is absolutely perfect for his riding style. He does a lot of jumping and just rides that bike so well. Someone who just wants to flow a little bit more and just get over the rocks a little bit easier, they're going to feel better on a 29er. But there really is no clear winner. The Trance